An American veteran steps onto a plane, his limp a constant reminder of the wounds he carries from Iraq. He paid extra for a comfortable seat, knowing his knee would give him trouble. But just minutes after settling in, the flight attendant approaches and asks him to move, so a family can sit together. No one speaks up. Quietly, he stands, making his way to a cramped seat at the back of the plane, where the pain worsens with every movement. But what he didn't expect. 9 minutes later, the cockpit door opens, and what happens next will change everything. The early morning at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport was quiet, a faint mist hanging in the air, and the soft hum of travelers moving through the terminal. Thomas "Tom" Hargrove shuffled into the jet bridge, a heavy limp marking his every step. At 74, his movements were deliberate and slow, each stride a reminder of the battle scars he carried from his service in Iraq. His face, worn with years and hardship, was framed by thinning, graying hair that fell just above his ears, while his deep-set blue eyes, although tired, still held a spark of resolve. He had a tall, thin frame that once boasted strength, but now his broad shoulders slumped slightly, his posture diminished by the weight of years and memories. He leaned heavily on the worn wooden cane, its handle smooth from use, a silent companion through countless days of pain. His worn brown jacket clung to his frame, and the old military patches on his sleeve served as a silent reminder of his past. He hadn't flown in years, but today was different. He had booked this flight months in advance, paid for the extra legroom, just enough to ease the pressure on his knee. The flight was bound for Boston, where his granddaughter Sarah would be graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy, a moment he couldn't miss. Tom had always been a man of few words, a habit formed from years in the military, where emotions were often tucked away beneath the surface. He wasn't one to show discomfort, but his knee, the one shattered in battle, had never quite healed. He couldn't bear the thought of sitting in any seat other than 28C, the aisle seat with just enough space for his leg to stretch out. The pain was a constant companion, but today he tried to push it to the back of his mind. He had a mission, a reason to be there. As he approached the boarding gate, a woman in her late 30s, with sharp features and a professional air, glanced up from her clipboard. Lindsay, the flight attendant, was tall, with straight, shoulder-length blonde hair. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, the smile on her face polite but trained. She was used to dealing with demanding passengers, but something about Tom caught her eye. She noticed the slight tremble in his hand as he gripped the cane, the quiet determination in his expression, and something deeper, an unspoken story that lingered behind those tired blue eyes. But duty called, and as she glanced at her seating chart, a small frown creased her brow. She had to speak with him. "Excuse me, sir," Lindsay said softly but firmly, her smile not wavering. "Are you seated in 28C?" Tom looked up, nodding in acknowledgement. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, a tone that reflected the years he had lived, the battles he had fought, both on the field and in his own mind. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to his level. "We have a family that got separated during booking, a mother with 2 young children. Your seat is the only one available for them to sit together. Would you mind moving?" Tom felt the pang of frustration rise within him, his jaw tightening. He had already been through too much to be asked to sacrifice the one thing that had made flying tolerable. He had paid for the seat, after all, but looking at Lindsay's face, and then toward the family standing a few rows ahead, mother, 2 children, all looking tired, uncertain, he realized he had a choice to make. He could refuse, but it would hold up the flight. He could see the subtle pressure building in the cabin, the growing impatience of other passengers. He let out a long breath and looked down at his knee, knowing full well that moving to the back of the plane would cause him pain. "All right," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the hum of the terminal. "I'll move." Lindsay's smile remained, but there was a glint of appreciation in her eyes. She nodded and motioned for the family to step forward. Tom, with every step, could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, but he didn't look back. He just moved. As he made his way down the narrow aisle, his limp growing more pronounced with each step, he felt the discomfort in his leg tightening. He didn't ask for anyone's sympathy, nor did he want it. But there was no denying the ache in his heart as he settled into the cramped, uncomfortable seat near the back of the plane. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the feeling of being invisible, of being forgotten. But as he stared out the small window, he reminded himself of why he was here. He would see Sarah graduate. He would be there for her. And maybe, just maybe, today would be the day he finally felt seen again. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as Tom sat down in his new seat. He adjusted his cane beside him, stretching his long legs as best as he could in the tight space. The cramped environment felt more suffocating with every passing minute, his knee throbbing as it bent in a way it was never meant to. Around him, the noise of settling passengers faded into the background, but the discomfort in his leg grew louder. He sighed deeply, trying to focus on the comforting thought of seeing his granddaughter. Sarah had worked hard to get to this point. A graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, she was an achiever, someone Tom never thought he would be able to see walk across that stage. But now, the flight was proving to be a painful reminder that time was not on his side. As he settled in, trying to find a position that would at least dull the pain, Tom's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. The young flight attendant, Lindsay, was making her way down the aisle once again. She had a firm, purposeful stride, her blonde hair neatly tied back into a professional bun, her dark blue uniform accentuating her lean figure. Lindsay was one of those people who carried herself with an air of efficiency, her movements quick but controlled. At first glance, she seemed like a woman of confidence, but there was something in her eyes, an unspoken weight of responsibility that Tom noticed the moment she approached. Her pale skin and sharp features contrasted with the warmth of her smile, though today her smile was barely more than a polite gesture. She had been trained to manage passengers, to ensure their comfort, but now she was about to cross a line. "Excuse me, sir," Lindsay said, her tone still polite, though there was a hint of impatience hidden beneath it. "We have a family of 3 who got separated during booking. They're currently in different parts of the plane. Your seat is the only one where they can sit together." Tom's gaze flickered from her to the family, a mother with 2 young children. The mother, a woman in her mid-30s with dark brown hair tied up in a messy bun, seemed exhausted. She was cradling a toddler in her arms while trying to manage the 2 other children, both of whom were tugging at her clothes, visibly distressed. The sight of the young family only tugged at his heart for a moment. But then, his mind quickly refocused on his own need. "I booked this seat for a reason," Tom said quietly, his voice strained but steady. "My knee is a service-related injury. I really can't move." His eyes locked with Lindsay's, willing her to understand. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He just wanted a simple acknowledgement of his condition. Lindsay's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened. She had been trained to handle situations like this, to keep things running smoothly, even when emotions were high. But deep down, she was a woman who hated being the bearer of bad news. She had seen enough to know that her request would put him in an uncomfortable position. Still, she had to say it. "I understand, sir," she replied, her voice softer now. "But if we don't get this family seated together, we can't take off. I'm afraid it's a matter of timing. If you don't move, the flight will be delayed." Her words hung in the air between them. Tom looked at the family again, noticing the weary eyes of the mother and the impatience of the children. He saw himself in that mother, in the desire to be with his loved ones, to be there when it mattered most. But his heart ached as he realized what he had to do. He was a veteran, a man who had sacrificed for his country, and now it felt as though he was being asked to sacrifice his own comfort for the sake of a family he didn't know. But it wasn't just the discomfort that made it hard. It was the silent implication that he wasn't as important as the others, that his pain wasn't significant enough to matter. Tom closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, fighting the frustration rising within him. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, the unspoken judgment in the air. He had been trained to endure, to never show weakness, but today he was faced with a different kind of challenge. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but firm. "I'll move." His decision was made not out of kindness, but out of necessity. He couldn't hold up the flight, and he couldn't allow the family to suffer because of him. But as he stood, the weight of his decision settled heavy on his shoulders. The discomfort in his knee was nothing compared to the emotional toll he was beginning to feel. Lindsay nodded, relief washing over her, and motioned for the family to move forward. As Tom shuffled down the aisle to his new seat, the pain in his leg intensified. He didn't look back. He couldn't. But in his heart, he knew the real sacrifice was not just physical. It was the feeling of being invisible, of being forgotten. Tom's heart sank as he slowly stood from his seat, the pain in his knee intensifying with every movement. The weight of the decision he had just made settled heavily on his chest, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of hesitation. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers were becoming louder, more pronounced. He could feel their eyes on him, some out of curiosity, others from judgment, but none offering any sign of understanding. It wasn't unusual, he thought, for people to avoid confrontation. He had faced worse things in his life, things that required much more courage than enduring a few uncomfortable stares. Still, the feeling of isolation was suffocating. Thomas Hargrove, Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired. He muttered under his breath, his voice low but firm, as though reminding himself of who he was, of what he had endured. The words didn't carry far, and no one reacted. He shuffled down the aisle, his cane tapping softly against the floor with each step, the sound marking the slow passage of time. As he moved toward the back of the plane, his leg aching with each lurching step, Tom couldn't help but feel the sting of humiliation. The small cramped seat awaiting him at the end of the aisle was in row 34, barely enough room for him to sit without his leg cramped at an awkward angle. The seat was wedged between a young businessman, his face buried in a laptop, and a college student, his headphones snug against his ears. Tom had expected to be surrounded by strangers, but as he lowered himself into the seat, the lack of consideration from both men only amplified the bitterness in his chest. Neither looked up. Neither offered him a smile or a word of acknowledgement. The businessman glanced up for a split second, but quickly returned to his work, as though the presence of the elderly man in pain didn't matter. The college student didn't even flinch. Tom's knee, already throbbing from the effort of moving, was now pressed uncomfortably against the back of the seat in front of him. The space was so tight that he couldn't stretch his legs, couldn't find a way to sit without feeling the pull in his muscles. His hands gripped the armrests as he tried to settle into the chair, but every movement made his knee ache even more. The smell of stale coffee and cleaning supplies lingered in the air, mixing with the sound of the plane's engines and the occasional murmur of passengers. Tom closed his eyes, shutting out the discomfort, but it was impossible to ignore the quiet humiliation that gnawed at him. He had given up his seat for someone else, for the good of the flight, for the family, but it felt like a betrayal of himself. He had sacrificed for others his entire life, first in the military, and now in the quiet indignities of everyday life. And yet, here he was again, forgotten, disregarded. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. His knee pulsed, and the ache in his joints felt like a constant reminder of everything he had given, everything he had lost. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. But the growing discomfort, the pressure building in his chest, and the sense that he had been discarded, it all began to weigh on him. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Tom leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath, his eyes still closed. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't asking for anyone to recognize his sacrifice. But for once, he wished someone would simply see him, see the man he had once been, the man he still was beneath the pain and the years. 3 rows ahead of Tom, Elizabeth Carter sat with her back straight and her posture impeccable, as though her professional life had prepared her for moments of quiet observation. At 42, she was the picture of composed elegance. Her sharp features were framed by shoulder-length auburn hair, slightly curled at the ends, and her green eyes were intense, scanning the cabin with quiet curiosity. She was a corporate lawyer, known for her no-nonsense demeanor and quick wit, both in the courtroom and in her personal life. Her thin, well-toned frame, dressed in a tailored gray suit, spoke of her precision, nothing ever out of place. However, today, as she sat in her window seat, a slight frown had settled on her face as she watched the scene unfold in front of her. The act of silently witnessing Tom's discomfort stirred something inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet sense of injustice. Elizabeth wasn't a woman who often engaged in what she considered trivial matters. She was used to handling large cases, presenting complex arguments, and navigating high-stakes situations. Yet something about this man, a veteran who had served his country, being forced to suffer in silence, was impossible to ignore. Her gaze shifted from Tom to the flight attendants bustling around the cabin, and her fingers instinctively reached for her phone. She unlocked it quickly and opened her messaging app, a frown deepening as she typed out a message. Her fingers moved swiftly over the screen, the words flowing with precision, much like the contracts she reviewed daily. Passenger with service-related injury being forced to give up seat. Very unfair. Flight 218. She hit send, her message quickly making its way to her friend, Laura, who worked in customer service for the airline. Laura had always been a reliable contact, someone who knew how to get things done behind the scenes. Elizabeth knew that the airline's reputation would never survive this kind of public display of neglect if it wasn't addressed. As the message sent, Elizabeth's eyes flickered back to Tom. He was still seated in the cramped space at the back of the plane, looking worn, exhausted, as though the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders. The business student next to him had his headphones on, and the young man beside him, seemingly oblivious, was typing away on his laptop. No one was paying attention. No one except Elizabeth. She had seen too many cases of unfairness in her career, too many times when those in power had used their position to ignore the struggles of others. But this was different. This wasn't just a business dispute or a legal case. This was a human being, a man who had sacrificed so much for his country, now left to suffer in silence. Elizabeth's fingers hovered over her phone screen as she waited for a response from Laura. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her. She knew she couldn't stay silent. The thought of a man in pain, being ignored by those around him, was something she couldn't ignore herself. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a response. The message was short, but it was enough. "I've flagged this with our operations team. It'll be escalated." Elizabeth's lips twitched slightly as she read the message, a sense of satisfaction settling in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She looked back at Tom, who was now leaning forward slightly, trying to find any way to make himself comfortable in the cramped seat. She felt a pang of sympathy, but more than that, she felt a deep sense of resolve. No one should be treated this way, not after everything Tom had been through. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Elizabeth resolved to keep an eye on the situation. She wouldn't let it slip through the cracks. The plane had been airborne for nearly 20 minutes when the quiet buzz of activity in the cabin seemed to fade. The soft hum of the engines and the low murmur of passengers were replaced by the rapid clatter of Captain Michael Reynolds's boots as he made his way from the cockpit. His uniform, perfectly pressed, gave him an air of command, but it wasn't just the neatness of his attire that drew attention. It was the presence he carried with him. At 48 years old, Michael was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the space around him. His dark hair, graying at the temples, matched the salt and pepper stubble on his square jaw, giving him an air of maturity. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, reflected years of experience, both in the cockpit and in the military. He had spent over 20 years as a pilot in the Air Force, his career marked by discipline and precision. Despite his calm demeanor, those who knew him could see the weight of leadership in his every movement. As he stepped out of the cockpit, he was immediately aware of the tension in the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes following his every move. Michael was no stranger to the reactions his presence provoked. It was clear from the way his posture stood tall and unwavering that he wasn't concerned with what others thought. What mattered now was making things right. Michael had already received the message about Sergeant Thomas Hargrove. As a veteran himself, he couldn't ignore the injustice of the situation. Tom, a man who had served his country, had been asked to give up the seat he had booked for medical reasons, the very seat he needed to ease the pain from his service-related injury. It was a mistake, one that Michael felt personally. He had seen too many men and women in uniform endure sacrifices and hardships. This was just another reminder of the debts owed to those who had served. He moved through the aisle, his steps firm, and every head turned as he passed. His gaze was steady, his purpose clear. As he approached row 34, where Tom was seated, the cabin fell into a heavy silence. The flight attendants, sensing what was unfolding, stopped in their tracks. Tom was seated between two passengers, neither of whom had acknowledged his discomfort. His posture was stiff, his face drawn, and Michael could tell the pain from his knee was becoming unbearable. Michael stopped directly in front of Tom, his face softening just slightly as he took in the sight of the man who had given so much. Without hesitation, Michael raised his hand in a formal salute. The crisp motion seemed to echo in the stillness of the cabin. "Sergeant Thomas Hargrove," Michael said, his voice carrying clearly. "On behalf of the airline and as a fellow serviceman, I offer my sincerest apologies for the injustice you've experienced today." Tom blinked, surprised by the captain's presence and the unexpected apology. He had expected nothing, certainly not this. The words seemed to linger in the air, heavy with meaning. No one had said anything to him in the way Michael had. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of his service, of his sacrifice. The passengers around them remained silent, some unsure of how to react. Michael's eyes remained fixed on Tom, waiting for the moment to sink in. Then, turning to the flight attendants who had gathered near the back of the cabin, Michael continued. "Please escort Sergeant Hargrove to seat 1A, he said. "It's the least we can do to make things right." There was a moment of hesitation, but then one of the attendants, a young woman with dark hair and sharp eyes, nodded. She moved forward, signaling to Tom. As Tom slowly stood, the discomfort in his knee making the action feel like an eternity, Michael reached out a hand to steady him. It wasn't out of pity. It was a gesture of respect, of camaraderie. Tom, still slightly stunned, allowed the captain's hand to guide him forward. As they moved toward the front of the plane, the mood in the cabin shifted. The passengers, who had been quiet observers of Tom's earlier discomfort, now seemed to sit a little straighter. Some exchanged looks, others nodded, but no one spoke. It was as if the simple act of recognition had changed the atmosphere, had brought a sense of dignity back into the cabin. And as Tom passed row after row, his steps were a little lighter, his heart a little less burdened. As Michael led Tom to the front of the plane, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The movement toward the front wasn't just a simple shift of seats, it was a moment of recognition, of dignity restored. Lindsay followed closely behind, guiding Tom with a subtle gesture as they approached row 1. The bright, open space of the first-class section felt almost foreign to Tom after the tight confines of row 34. It wasn't just the physical distance between rows that made it feel so different. It was the change in atmosphere, the shift from discomfort to a place of recognition. As Tom approached seat 1A, the man seated there, a sharply dressed businessman in his early 40s, looked up from his phone. He had a well-groomed beard, dark hair, and glasses that gave him a serious, yet approachable look. His expression changed from mild confusion to surprise as he stood quickly, his hand already extended toward Tom. His tailored navy suit fit him perfectly, with a deep burgundy tie that complemented his professional demeanor. "Sir, it's an honor," he said, his voice firm, though there was a note of humility in it. Tom, still in a state of mild disbelief, blinked for a moment. The businessman's words struck him harder than he expected. He had always been accustomed to service, to giving, to the role of a protector, not to being the one honored. He offered a small, uncomfortable nod, his hands still trembling slightly from the pain in his knee. As he lowered himself into the plush seat, he felt the difference. The soft leather, the extra legroom. It was a welcome change, but it didn't take away the exhaustion in his bones or the weight of the last few minutes. It was then that the ripple started. First, a few quiet claps, tentative and unsure. But as Tom settled in, the clapping grew louder, and soon the entire cabin was filled with applause. It wasn't the kind of applause you give when someone gives a good speech or performs well. It was a different kind of acknowledgement. It was a recognition of sacrifice, of service, of something far greater than just a seat. Tom's eyes scanned the cabin, his face flushing slightly as the clapping continued. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He wasn't sure how to feel. A young man, likely in his late 20s, rose from his seat 3 rows ahead of Tom. His features were soft, his face marked by the innocence of youth. His dark eyes, however, carried the weight of something much deeper, something that made his gaze lock onto Tom's with an intensity that couldn't be ignored. He took a step toward Tom, then paused, the words seemingly caught in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Sergeant Hargrove," the young man began, his voice breaking slightly. "You saved my squad in Fallujah in 2004. I was just a kid then, scared out of my mind. I've been meaning to thank you for so long, and I never had the chance." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Tom felt a lump form in his throat. The young man's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, his body shaking slightly as he reached out, not to shake Tom's hand, but to place a hand gently on his shoulder. "You gave us all another chance at life," the man said, his voice full of quiet reverence. Tom was still frozen in place, unsure of what to say. His mind flashed back to that time in Fallujah, the days and nights spent in the heart of the battle, the faces of men he had fought beside, and the sacrifices they all had made. He didn't expect this. Not here. Not now. But as the young man stepped back and returned to his seat, the gravity of the moment settled on Tom. He hadn't been forgotten. Not by this man. Not by this moment. As the applause finally began to fade, Tom looked up to meet the eyes of the passengers around him. There was no shame in his chest, no regret. He had done his duty. And now, for the first time in a long time, he was being recognized, not for the medals or the honors, but for simply being who he was. As the plane began its descent into Boston Logan International Airport, Tom gazed out of the window. The city was just beginning to wake up, the early morning light reflecting off the water, casting a soft glow over the skyline. His knee ached from the journey, but the discomfort was bearable now. He no longer felt the isolation of the cramped seat or the weight of the past few hours. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, and so had his mood. He had been recognized, not just as a passenger, but as a man who had given everything for his country. For the first time in a long while, Tom allowed himself to take a deep breath, exhaling the tension he had been holding in his chest. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign switched off, Tom carefully gathered his belongings. The flight attendants had been kind to him, offering him water and even a blanket during the flight. But it wasn't the comfort of the amenities that made the journey special. It was the recognition. As he stood to exit, Lindsay, the young flight attendant who had been so kind to him, smiled warmly and nodded her head in his direction. He returned the gesture, feeling a flicker of gratitude toward her. When Tom stepped off the plane into the terminal, his eyes scanned the crowd for his granddaughter, Sarah. She was the reason he had made this journey. His heart swelled as he spotted her standing near the baggage claim area, dressed in her crisp navy uniform. She was tall, with dark brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and a proud smile on her face. Her uniform was impeccable, the gold stripes on her shoulders glinting in the light. She was a reflection of everything Tom had fought for: the future, the next generation, strong and unwavering. "Grandpa Tom," Sarah called, her voice filled with excitement as she ran toward him. Tom, despite the pain in his knee, opened his arms wide and embraced her tightly, holding her like he never wanted to let go. Her warmth and energy made him forget about the discomfort that had lingered throughout the flight. After a long, emotional hug, Sarah pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a smile. "You made it," she said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Her words were simple, but they meant everything to him. A few weeks later, Tom received a letter from the airline. It was an official apology, accompanied by a full refund for his flight, and a card that read, "As of today, you are a lifetime guest of honor with Transcontinental Airlines." Tom read the letter slowly, the words sinking in. He had been recognized not just as a veteran, but as someone who deserved respect and gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to him. Then a second letter arrived, this time from the Department of Defense. It was a formal notice confirming that a long-overlooked action report had been reopened and updated in Tom's military file. The report, dating back to 1968 during the Vietnam War, detailed Tom's heroic actions in rescuing 6 Marines from a burning vehicle under heavy enemy fire. His heroism had been overlooked for years, but now it was officially recorded, his actions finally receiving the acknowledgement they deserved. Tom placed the letter next to the folded flag that sat on the mantel in his living room. The flag had been presented to him at his retirement ceremony, a symbol of the sacrifices he had made. As he looked at both the flag and the letter, a wave of emotion washed over him. For the first time in many years, he felt truly seen. His sacrifices, his service, his pain, it had all been recognized. He wasn't forgotten. He had made a lasting mark, not only in the lives of the men he had served with, but in the hearts of those who mattered most. As we come to the end of Tom's journey, we are reminded that sometimes the greatest recognition doesn't come in the form of medals or awards, but in simple acts of kindness, respect, and acknowledgement. It's easy to feel invisible in a world that moves so fast, but just as Tom found his moment of recognition, so too can we. Whether it's in our work, our relationships, or the quiet acts of everyday life, each of us has a story that deserves to be heard, a contribution that deserves to be recognized. In our busy lives, let's not forget to slow down and appreciate the people around us. A kind word, a small gesture, or simply being present can make all the difference to someone who needs it. Just like Tom, you are seen, you are valued, and your story matters. Thank you so much for watching and following along with Tom's story. If this journey touched your heart, please share this video with your friends and family, Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us, and we're so grateful for each of you who takes the time to be a part of this community. Wishing you all peace, joy, and moments of recognition in your own lives. Until next time, take care and keep spreading kindness wherever you go.